Hello, everybody. My name is Andy Menon. I am the founder of RPA Vanguard and also an integrations engineer and lead SME. And today's session, we will be covering UiPath apps, functions, expressions, and also in the process, we'll be talking about rules. And I am also the host of the RPA Vanguard channel on YouTube, and my co-host Pradeep is my co-host uh, on another channel. It's called Automation Rocket Ship, where we talk about RPA in general. It's more of a talk show and technical discussion, whereas RPA Vanguard kind of focuses on a lot of technical aspects of UiPath RPA. And I would request the audience to check these two um, channels out. So in today's session, we are going to start off by covering the world before UiPath apps, functions, and expressions. How were we working with UiPath apps when they first came? And then we are going to go into functions and expressions to show you the difference between the before and the after. The idea is to reinforce how functions and expressions reinforce the low code design process for people to build very effective interfaces using UiPath apps. And next, we will get right down to it with a demo of a quick start kit. And in this quick start kit, we will attempt to demonstrate the entire length and breadth of the apps, functions, and expressions that are available today in the UiPath toolkit. And we'll also show you how to combine functions, expressions, and rules in apps. The exception to this rule would be a few functions that we'll not be covering today, because they will make a lot more sense when we cover it with other subjects such as integration with data service, which we will be talking about 2 weeks from now. So some of the examples of the functions that we'll not be focusing on today will be filter and lookup functions. Other than that, we will try to demonstrate almost everything that is available in the UiPath apps toolkit. So with this, I'm going to switch over to a demo that we have prepared for today, and we'll start off with our basic example. I hope you can see my screen. You should be seeing my browser now. What I have here
Yeah, we
is,
don't see it quite yet. Oh, there you go.
okay, excellent. Okay, so what I have here is a basic kit that I have prepared, and we will go through all of these examples. But like I said, we will start with the world before apps, functions, and expressions. And I'm going to start off with this example here. This is what I call as a typical conventional UI. It demonstrates how we used to work with interactive applications before apps, functions, and expressions. This simple demo has a combo box or a drop-down box, and the question is, should I make the date picker visible? Right? There's a choice. The default choice is no, but if I select yes, a date picker appears. And then if I choose no, the date picker disappears. Right? Now, this has been designed without apps, functions, or expressions. Right? And this was the world we used to have before we had functions and expressions. So I'm going to scoot over to the design of the app and show you how that has been built. So I am on example 1, and I'm going to go into this page here. Here is the date picker. And if I go down to the right on the design of it, it has a couple of values, right? And this is how we use a list function to populate the date picker, right? It's a list and it has a couple of values. And then we give it a default selected value, saying that when the screen is presented, the default value of no must be visible for this date picker control, right? And here is the date picker. Now, what we have done is, with the old style of working with apps, we usually go into the events of a control. Almost every control on the app has got some kind of an event. And when that event is triggered, it is handled by a rule. So in this case, it is the date picker control has got a value changed event. That means when the value changes with the user selection, this rule or this event is kicked off and it must be handled by a rule. So now if I click on the edit rule, here I'm writing a simple if or else condition. What I'm telling the app is, if I select the value yes from the toggle date picker drop down control, which you see on the left, I have to make the hidden attribute of the date picker calendar to false, right? But if I select no, then hidden must be made true. Please note that this is a negative question. The question is, should a control be hidden or not? The question is not about whether a control must be visible or not. So we have to make sure that when I select yes, the hidden property of the date picker becomes false and the date picker becomes visible, right? Conversely, when I select no, then the resolvable hidden must become true, right? Which means the date picker is hidden. So this is how we were working with apps before apps functions and expressions came along. So with that, what I'm going to do now is move over to the second example, and I'm going to show you a much more complicated example or a much more advanced example. And I'm going to show you how less of a code we have used to achieve a lot, right? Minimal code with maximum output, right? So if I switch to the second example, here we have the same UI, not much of a difference. But if I select yes this time, you see that a group of controls has been rendered visible. And if I say no, that entire group of controls disappears, right? So we have achieved a bit more than what we did last time. Last time we had just a date picker. This time we have a date picker and two buttons. And then I'm going to click on this button and I'm going to change the date picker color to red. Observe what happened when I did that. The button that I used to change the color was disabled automatically. And the button, the reset button, got enabled automatically. Now, when I hit reset color, the opposite happens. The date picker is restored back to normal, and these two buttons go back to their natural state, right? So this UI, although much more featured, much more full featured than the previous example you saw, has been built using purely, mostly apps, functions, and expressions. And we'll also show you the examples of how we have used rules in combination with apps, functions, and expressions. So for that, I'm going to go back again to the design, and I'm going to get into the second example. In the second example, we have a date picker here again. And this time I have three controls all put inside another control called a container, right? So this is a container here. You see, if I click on it, there's a container here. Now the question is, why did I do this? Why did I put these controls in a container? There are a couple of reasons for this. The first reason is I want to group all the controls by functionality into a logical group. I want to put them in a box, and that is what I have done. And second, in the last example, you saw me manipulating the date picker control and making that date picker control visible or invisible, right? But the problem with that approach is I have one too many controls here. If I manipulate each control individually, then you can imagine the level of effort involved. So what do I do instead? I put all of these controls in a box and I make that box visible or invisible, right? That's the first thing that you have to observe. The second significant thing that you have to observe is, in the previous example, when you looked at the events of the date picker control, there was a rule here. There is no rule here now, right? So you can see all that work that you did to write that if and else is gone, right? And we have used apps, functions, and expressions to do the work for us. So how did we do that? So one of the first things that you will notice, the most significant things that you will notice is that if I go to the general property of a date picker, we have this time associated the date picker control with an app variable, right? And here it says that the selected value of the date picker must be bound to an app variable called show date picker, right? What happens here is when we have this arrangement, there is a two-way communication between the control and the app variable. First, if I select a value from the date picker, that value is automatically updated to the variable. Now, it is also possible for me to alter the value of this variable and change the state of the date picker. So this is a two-way communication. I make changes to the UI, it changes the value of the variable. I change the value of the variable, it is possible for me to change the state of the UI. So this is one of the fundamental concepts of apps, functions, and expressions, is we do not try to manipulate the value of the control by itself, but we associate the control with a variable and we work with those variables. In the last example, you saw me saying, hey, if I choose a value of yes from the date picker control, then do this. Otherwise, do something else. This time, I'm not going to do that. I'll be working directly with the date picker variable. That is significant, and that significant and is the fundamental concept of UiPath apps and expressions. The second significant thing that you will observe here is the container. I'm sorry, this is like my mouse is a bit, yeah, here is the container. And the container has got a value or an attribute called hidden. This is an example of functions and expressions combined into an inline rule. This is a dynamic rule. Observe what is happening here. We have the date picker control associated with a variable. And instead of inspecting the value of the date picker, we are looking at the value of the variable itself. And in combination with the function, the if function, we are telling the app that if the date picker value or the app variable value changes to yes, then make the hidden attribute false. If not, make the hidden attribute true. This is an example of a dynamic rule. Basically, what is happening is the rule runs as you interact with the application, right? We all have seen how we sign up on websites, or how we change our passwords. As we change our passwords, there is a rule below the password text box that shows you how your password goes from weak to good to strong to very strong, right? That's an example of a dynamic rule. It works in the background as you interact with the application, right? So here, that's exactly what's happening. As I select yes or a no, this entire control is rendered visible or invisible. And in the process, very powerful thing happens. All the controls that are the children of that container are toggled visible or invisible. So with very little work, this is the emphasis of the low code aspect of UiPath apps, functions, and expressions. With very little code, you have built a very effective app, even if it means it's at the most basic level, right? You have managed to enable or disable a feature of your app with just a simple line of code and an app variable, right?
Yep, and Andy, this is great. And if our viewers are experienced in terms of other programming languages, if they have
Right.
gone through anything like C Sharp or .NET, if they have that kind of background, you can see the example that Andy presented, the first version and the second version with functions and expression and with rules. But the way your UI, the UI with which the user is interacting, and how the properties or rules are being defined and how they impact the UI. You can compare it similar to if you're coming from a .NET background, just so you can relate to it, right? How that relates to it. You would see the concept of model and view, right? So that's exactly the concept. That's where it goes. So initially, all the validations, you can put everything in the view itself, right? In the screen itself, you're putting all the validations. So your view is very tightly coupled with all the rules and all the business validation. But once you put in functions and expression, that actually separates. So that's a segregation of responsibility, right? So now you have a model, you have a view. The model actually makes a decision what kind of data needs to go on the view, and then the view renders that information to the user. So that would give you a comparative way if you want to look at it, and how UiPath Apps makes it so easy to build that structure compared to any of the standard traditional programming languages if you're building something in that, right? So you can see that comparative development effort that you have to put in if you're building with apps. One another thing I want to highlight here, what Andy talked about, the dynamic rule, right? So that makes this, because of having apps and functions directly integrated, so seamlessly integrated with the presentation view, your function, your code is actually uh, represents what is called as responsive UI. And that's why apps is actually one of the best candidates if you're building a mobile application. It actually becomes a very important that you can use apps and you can build a mobile front end for the user without much of an effort, because the UI is always, you can bind it to data service, you can bind it to storage buckets, you can, there are a ton of ways you can get the data, right? And if there is an automation behind the scene, you can always integrate the processes, the variables, the outputs coming out from the processes can be bound to apps directly, and that way there are a lot of legwork is already there, right? So you just have to put in and bring it in, and that way you can perform that integration.
Right.
That's all, Andy. Please
Yeah.
continue.
Thank you. The other thing that I wanted to point out, I mean, Pradeep and I just spoke about the dynamic rule, but a dynamic rule cannot be effectively used everywhere because you saw in the last session, Pradeep created a form, and then at the end he put a button there, and then the expectation was when we click on the button, something must happen. Now, that is a concept of a deliberate rule, right? Basically, what happens is when you are filling up a form, you are not expecting the form to be filled automatically every time you fill in every field in a form, right? You expect the form to be filled when the all the fields are filled in by the user, and then the user initiates a deliberate action by clicking a button to submit the data of the form to the online site, right? So that's an example of a deliberate rule. That deliberate rule does not work as you're interacting with the UI. It works after you have initiated a deliberate action, right? That is reason number one. The second reason is, even if you look at some of the features of the app, you really can't manipulate everything with dynamic rules. Let me show you an example. Let me get back to the date picker and get into the hint text column or the attribute, and let me hit the equal to button on my keyboard. You can see that the resources tab opens up, right? That means that this hint text can be influenced by apps, functions, and expressions, right? Or you can write a dynamic rule to influence this attribute of the date picker control. But that is not true in every case, right? Let us go into the styles attributes of this control. Let me go into the font, and now let me hit equal to. You see the resources tab doesn't show up. That means that these attributes cannot be controlled dynamically, right? Similarly, if you look at the bold, italics, and the underline attributes, they are all selections that you have to make as you're designing your app. But that does not mean that you cannot control them in a different mechanism, right? And that is where the concept of rules proves to be very reliable and indispensable, right? So that is why I prepared this example of changing the color attribute of the date picker control because you see that I cannot manipulate these color values by writing an inline app function or expression. I cannot do that. So I have to do it with a deliberate action, right? And in this case, the action is to either click on the red button to change the background color of this date picker to red, or change it back to the normal app color, which is the off-white color that you see here on the screen. So this is how you combine uh, apps, functions, and expressions with rules. Where you want some kind of a dynamic interaction, you can influence that with functions and expressions. But where you have to control a few things with deliberate actions, you use rules, right? So if I go over to the rule behind the change to red button, you see there is a rule. And all I'm doing here is manipulating the background color of the date picker, which is visible when I'm writing a rule, right, for me to manipulate, right? And I set a rule saying that if I click on this button, change the background color of the date picker to red, right? Similarly, if I go to the reset color, if I go to the button or the rule behind it, I'm saying, okay, now change the color of the background of the date picker back to the off-white default color, right? And that is why you see an example of me manipulating something that cannot be manipulated with functions or expressions being manipulated by a deliberate rule. And the deliberate rule is to click on a button, right? Similarly, if I hit reset color, we are back to normal again, right? But that said, you also saw these buttons going as enabled and disabled. How did we do that? So let me click on the change to red button and I go to general. And if I look at the disabled property, look what I have done here. I'm toggling the disabled property with an inline expression. I am telling the disabled property of the button, stay disabled as long as the background color of the date picker is red, right? Because once the color has changed to red, then that button, there is no need to click that button again. So here again, the question is negative. Should the control be disabled or not, right? And I'm saying if the color of the date picker is red, change it to keep it disabled. Otherwise, change it back to enabled. And you can see this dynamically returns true or false based on the current color of the date picker. Now for reset, it's slightly different. Here you can see that I'm not only using an expression, I'm using a not function, right? Because it is disabled, you got to now change it on its head, right? You got to turn the whole rule on its head. And you're saying, as long as the color is not red, keep this disabled, right? And that is why you saw these when it changes to red. There is no use of the red button as long as this is red. It keeps red. The button is disabled and reset color is enabled. And when I hit reset color, it goes disabled again. So here with this simple example, you have seen multiple things. You have seen how to write dynamic rules with functions and expressions. You have seen how you can influence the interactivity of your user interface elements with functions and expressions. And you also have seen a use case for when and why you must be using deliberate rules, right? Like you saw with the buttons. So by the end of this example, you should have a fair idea of the demos that I'll be covering downstream, right? So when I'm using a function, an expression, or a rule, you must have a fair idea of why I have done that, right? So with that, what we are going to do now is to go into the next example of simple math. Now, in this example, there are just a couple of controls. It is expecting us to put in the first number and the second number, and there are a couple of output lines. Observe that the result is 0. I'm going to put in a couple of numbers. This is again a dynamic rule. As I exit the second text box or the second input, you can see the result is instantly displayed. The result is identical, except one is written using an expression, one is written using the sum function, right? So let's go back to the design and look at example number 3. Once again, 2 text boxes, each one is bound to its own variable, right? Var num1 and var num2. And here is an expression. It is very simple. It concatenates a string with an inline result of the addition operator. So num1 plus num2 is an expression, and appending a string with an append operator, which is the ampersand, is another expression. So this is purely an expression based operation, right? And that is why your result says result using expression, right? So how is the second one different? Now, if you want to write something more sophisticated, more cleaner, you can use the sum function, right? Here you can see that I have appended a string, but this time to add 2 numbers, I have used the sum function, open brackets, the 2 numbers separated by a comma. So you can adopt any style you need. It all depends on what you prefer, but the results of both these are going to be identical. Now comes the question. How do I do subtraction, right? I have the sum function. How do I do subtraction? If I put in minus 421 and exit, you can see that you have minus 297, which is correct. Now, one of the things that I would like to point out about the sum function, especially the sum function or the addition operator, is its ability to adapt to your input. Now, I'm going to change this input to A, B, C, and D, E, F. One of the things that's very powerful about the sum function is you can use it to validate whether your inputs are numbers or strings. If you add a number to a string, it will give you back a number. So for example, if I add DEF to 1, 2, 3, it will return 1, 2, 3, which proves that my first number DEF is a string. That means you can use this logic to validate for strings or numeric input, right? So I want to point this out because you can play with this and you can find out how powerful the sum function is when it comes to doing even the simple validations, right? So with this example, we are going to go to a slightly more enhanced example, and I'm going to click on simple math 2. You will observe something very significant here, and this goes back to a question that we received in the first part last week. If you observe the values here, it is DEF and 1, 2, 3. But those were values that I inserted in the previous screen. Why are they here? The reason is because of app variables, right? It shows a very powerful feature of app variables. And using app variables, you can transfer data from one part of the application to the other part of the application. And I think a question came last week about if I want to move from page 1 to page 2 or one page to the other, how would I move the data? App variables are a very powerful way of doing that. So if I scoot over to the design and bring simple math 2, here you can observe that although the name of the controls are different from the previous screen, here the names of the controls are num value 2 and num value 1, whereas the names of the controls in the previous screen were value 1 and value 2. Regardless of the name of those controls, they are bound to the same app variable. If you look at it, they are the same old app variables, var num1 and var num2. So you see, with the simple association of variables, you can transfer data from one part of the application to another part. That's one of the subtle but very powerful features that I want to point out. And to prove that, I'm going to now change this back to 6, 7, and 8. And I'm going to X out of that box. And if I go back to the previous screen, you see the value 6, 7, 8 here. So this is how you do data transfer between different parts of the application. So now let's get back to what this screen is doing. What you're seeing here is a demonstration of all basic mathematical operators in action. Here is the sum, there is a difference, there's the product, and here's the remainder, right? I'm going to come back to this note, but you can see that with simple expressions, I'm able to do almost most of the mathematical operators. But I'm going to pose a question to the audience here, and let me know what would be the biggest problem with building something like this. If I'm doing something related to mathematical operations, based on your experience, what do you think I have to take care of? What do you think I must be very careful about? Because apps and functions and expressions is so easy that we can make mistakes.
And you
Anyone?
can just put your answers in chat if you want.
Yeah.
Zero divider.
Correct.
There
Correct.
you go.
Yes. Excellent. Yes. Divide by 0. Correct. You see, here is the problem. I might have constructed this app with basic functions and expressions, but it is very easy for me to make a mistake. I can totally forget about division by 0 error, right? So here I'm going to try to mitigate that, and I walked myself into trouble on this user interface, and I'm going to show you why. Let me go into the second number and say 0. The division part of it is gone. It has disappeared. It has not shown me the error. It is supposed to show me division by 0 error. I have coded for this, but my app UI is not showing me that. Now, why is that? Right? So let me go back and put in a valid number. The remainder is back, but along with that, you see, I have a message. This is for you, audience. It's not for me, but I have made a mistake of building rules in conflict, right? And I'm going to show you what that means. So let's go back to the design. And I have these two input boxes. I have the expression for the sum, which is the plus operator, the minus operator, the product. Everything is easy, no problem. But when it comes to the expression here, I have written an inline function using the if condition or the if function saying, if the second number is 0 or is blank, show me the division by error message. If not, show me division of number 1 divided by var number 2. So I would expect to see this error message, but I'm not seeing that. Now here's why I'm not seeing that. And that is because of the problem here with the hidden attribute. What I'm actually doing here is I have written one rule here for the hidden attribute in conflict with this validation rule. Basically, on one hand, I'm telling the green label, hey, show me division by error if the numeric value of the second variable is 0 or blank. But at the same time, I'm telling the app, you know what? If the second number is 0 or blank, hide this control. You see, I walked myself into trouble. I have written a rule in conflict with what I want to see. So what is happening is the hidden attribute is suppressing this rule. And therefore, when I go in and put 0, I don't see anything with division. So be very careful, because it is easy to get lost and write rules that are in conflict. And when you write rules in conflict, you can spend several minutes or many minutes just to figure out what your app is doing. So this is an example of how easy things are to build, but at the same time, if we try to build some things, everything into our app, we can run into trouble. So that's pretty much what I wanted to cover on this example of simple math. Pradeep, you got anything to add?
Not specifically, but these examples, the purpose of sharing this example, these examples that Andy has, is to show you the minute differences, right? The actual differences between how things can be done. So these are varieties of ways. So it's kind of a developer deep dive. That's what kind of our objective is, to build these sessions and not just talk about the theoretical aspect of it, but in all practicality, how you would actually build and what are the areas that you need to be careful about. Um, and there are several, and mind you, by end of this, our goal is to have walk you through each of these validations or parameters, the functions as well. So you know what you are getting into, and if you already have some prior experience, that's very good. But if not, then the richness of the features that are available as part of the apps. Even though it's just browser based, and some may think that it may not have enough functionality, but it's pretty robust in terms of what it has to offer and build.
Right. Thank you, Pradeep. So now we will scoot over to the next example. We have already covered this before. You might have seen the append operator in action. But what I'm going to try to demonstrate here, it's a deliberate example of whether we have to use expression, whether we have to use function, or whether we have to use mixed style, a combination of expressions and functions. So let me put this in here. Right? So I'm going to click this button. Beautiful. I get the value from the first and second box appended. I hit the second button, same thing. Third button, same thing. Right? The results are identical, but they're written using 3 different styles. Right? If I go back to the example, again, please note, this is an example of a deliberate action. So I have to use rules. So I click on this button, I get in, edit rule. This is written using an expression with the append operator. The append operator is very simple. All it does is you put an append in line and it is going to append your variables together. It might be string with a combination of variables. It's as simple as that. But if you don't want to use too many ampersands in your expression, like I do not like too many ampersands. I would like to go for the concat function. So if I click on the blue button, it is the same thing, except I have concat, open brackets, and then the string followed by the 2 variables, right? Close. Now you might prefer to write it in mixed style. I want to combine the expression style and the function style and use the mixed style. In this case, if I go in here, you can see what I've done here. It's a string with an append operator appended to concat, a variable, and within the function I've used the append operator. So you can use various styles based on your preference to produce the same effect, right? So the concat function, the append operators are very powerful and allow you to, kind of transform your data from one state to another, right? So the emphasis here is that you can choose multiple styles based on your preference. And one of the other things that you might observe is there is a summary link here. When I click this, there are certain observations that I have left here for your benefit. you can go through these and also look at some of the notes and observations that are put in here that you can read as you are exploring this example, at a later time. The next example I'll be going on is my favorite example, and that is the string search example. The reason I call it my favorite example is by using 4 functions associated with strings, I'm going to show you how to build very powerful validation methods in your apps, right? Now, here is a simple screen which accepts a US part number, right? And the rules are listed on the left. It says that the part numbers must be 10 characters long, must be all uppercase, must start with part number colon, must have 1 pound symbol, and must end with US, right? So let's see what happens when I enter my part number. No, it's wrong, right? And then I put in 1, 2, 3, 4 US. Great, let me try to validate it. No, it's still wrong, right? Good, my part number is accepted. I'm going to change this to UK. Wrong again, right? So what we have done here is with simple string functions, we have managed to write a preliminary frontline validation before submitting your data to the backend, right? And let's go to the design and look at what we have done here. So this is the part number, box, and here is the button. Go to the events, edit rule, and here I'm using almost all of the functions that are available to manipulate strings. And this is how you write a grouped rule, right? You can see that there is a group added, and in that group, I have added the rules that I need, and I have separated them by AND. That means all of the 4 rules must validate to true if the part number has to be accepted, right? Here is an example of the starts with function. I'm saying if the part number starts with PN, and if that is true, accept it. And here is an example of a contains, right? If the part number contains a pound symbol, accept it. If the part number, ends with, by using the ends with function, accept it. And if the part number length is 10, then accept it, right? So you can see how we have used all the functions of a string, as of a string data type, and built a very compelling validation routine that you can have in your apps even before you send the data off to your backend system, right? And one of the other things that I would like you to observe here is when you are writing a rule, especially using if, I would highly recommend that you put in a group first, and then within the group, you add a compare rule, right? The reason being, if you add the compare rule without having a group, you will have to delete the entire rule and recreate it again, which means all the work below here, right, has to be deleted and recreated, right? And you really don't want to be doing that, right? Now, the other problem here is that you really can't very easily remove all of this here. Now I walked myself into trouble. You see that? I have walked myself into trouble. There's no way for me to delete this. So what do? I just give it a dummy function or expression and say equal to true, equal to true. Now, where am I going with this? You can group a lot many conditions into containers, and then you can separate those sub rules by using logical separators. You see that? here I've changed the rule saying if this group of rules is true or this group of rules is true, right? Then evaluate to true, or I can also separate them by and. So please do make it a habit of putting your if conditions within groups so that you can have a minimal rework in the future, right? Tomorrow, if I want to add another and rule, I can easily go inside this rule and add it, right? But if you have an or condition, it becomes problematic because you can't have all the rules separated by and then an or without grouping, right? Now you can see that I can separate these two rules out with a group because they are grouped separately. So this is something that you might want to take into consideration when you are building complex rules in apps, right? So what does this rule do? If the validation is true, then it says my validation is working fine, my part number is accepted, and I'm manipulating the UI element of that validation result label and changing it to color success, right? Now this value is declared as a constant when I load this form, right? Which means that I am going to be using these color values repeatedly, and therefore instead of hard coding them, I can put them in the loaded event of my form and initialize them only once, right? So in this case, the background color changes to green, but if the validation rule fails, the background color changes to red. Regardless of whether it is a failure or a success, the text color of the validation message changes to white, right? So you can see how I have manipulated the data elements of this form as also the graphical elements of this form based on my business logic. Now, this is an exercise that I will leave for the audience because at this point in time, you have gone through so many functions and expressions that you must be able to write something realistic and practical, right? So what I've done here is under this and this blue button, I have combined all the rules you saw with if condition under one and condition. There is a single call to an and function that I've used to take all the rules that you saw under the if condition and combine them to a single call. So that's something that I would like you to explore. So please do, when you get your hands on this app, please open up this rule and look behind the edit rule to see how that is working. So by this time, if you have picked up enough about apps, functions, and expressions, this should be a walk in the park. And you will really get used to how to write very practical functions to write realistic applications for your business.
Andy, now that you're at this stage, there are a few questions, so I think it's appropriate
Yeah,
time to take
yep.
it here at this time. So some of the questions came out regarding regex function, regex validation on the UiPath apps. Yeah, are these supported, and can we build these regex validation?
Currently, as of now, there aren't such advanced functions in apps, but there was a talk about it, and I'm hoping that they will add it because I remember giving this feedback on several functions that we need, especially the transformative functions or derivative functions. For example, you do not have something called substring, right? You
Yeah,
cannot take a piece of a string. You cannot change something to uppercase or lowercase, right? So I did definitely give a feedback. I hope that they put in regex, but for
yeah,
now the solution is basically to send this off to your automation and allow your automation to do that validation.
yeah. And if you remember, it was part of the roadmap in terms of the UiPath apps roadmap
Yeah,
itself. The string validation, adding some
yeah,
advanced code to it.
yeah,
Um, and it includes, so going back to your point, right? The substring is not there, but there are other ways you can achieve the
yeah,
same objective using left function write function and trim function, you can achieve some of that
Yeah,
for now. But yeah, like Andy said, we have already raised those questions because I mean, again, string validation is something very basic.
yeah,
Coming from any background, any developer background, we always expect them to be right there, and be
right.
available. So that's good. I think there is one other question is, um, and this question is, Red has asked this question regarding, I mean, mixture of alphabetic and numeric characters. Is this for the validation? Would you like to clarify a bit more, Red? You can unmute yourself. Go ahead, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
we can hear you.
Yeah, so I was wondering whether in that part, that third part, like in the second part. So right now it's just the example is just numeric. So what about if, like, say, it's a mixture of numeric and alphabetic characters in the mix there? How do you do it?
Well, I can off the cuff, I can suggest something. Is if you can have an app that accepts the numeric part in one place and then the alphabetical part in another text box, you could run individual validations, and if they validate to true, then you can say, okay, the input is accepted, right? And in the latest release of apps, you can see text boxes that are ready made for validating
That is correct.
numbers,
Yeah,
text, or email,
yeah,
right? So I also pointed out the effectiveness of the sum function, right? So let us say you are putting in a phone number 1-800 USA. You could have them put 1-800 in one box and USA in another box, and then validate them separately. You can validate the 1-800 for numeric, and you can validate USA for string. Because as I said, if you add a number to a string, it returns a number. That means your USA is actually alphabetical. So you can separate these out in the background, and if both these rules validate to true, you can then accept that input.
yeah. So in short, we don't have a like out of the box validation feature,
Yeah,
but there are definitely some workarounds. I
yeah,
know there are a couple of other topics that you still have to go through, Andy, but
yeah,
there's one another question I want to take up before we move forward, where you were talking about concatenating strings.
yeah,
So we're using ampersand, right?
yeah,
We can achieve the same feature using a plus sign,
yeah.
right?
You could,
So
but the problem with that is it? Sorry, go ahead, Pradeep. I
no,
thought
that
I
was
said something.
no, that was the question. That can we use plus sign? I think there are
Yes,
various ways to do it.
there are various ways, but please be careful what you're concatenating. If you're expecting the concatenation to append just two strings, it is fine. But if you're trying to concatenate two numbers, and if it
Yeah,
gives you a different result, then your app might malfunction.
yeah,
So please do be careful about what you are using the plus operator on. So my convention is I use the plus operator when I know my inputs have been validated to be numbers. If not, I try to use the concat function always. Now, linking this question to what Red just asked, there is a video on the RPA Vanguard channel on form validation, and there I talk about the sum function and how I validate something for numbers or strings. And I think you can take that and build something for alphanumeric validations. Does that answer your question?
I think the basic premise was whether we can use plus sign or not. But yeah,
Yeah,
so if you can use it for string concatenation, but like Andy said, there are caveats to it, right?
yep,
If you're dealing with numbers, then obviously it will behave like a numerical
right,
addition rather than a string concatenation.
right.
So we just have to keep in mind. There are a few other questions too, but let's try to wrap up the presentation that you have first, and then we'll come back to more questions.
Yeah. These should be quick, but we are going to be looking at the dynamic nature of app variables because we talked about apps variables, being numeric or string. And here you are going to see that in action. In this example, we are going to go to drop-down list, which is one of the most complex input controls, we might say. And I'm going to pick the multi-select drop-down here. That is because you have seen the single select drop-down when I started with these examples. What you're going to see in action here is the list control of the UiPath app and also the drop-down list. And you can see with this very simple setup, how many functionalities we have achieved. Let us say that you are in a computer store and you're going to pick up part numbers for your next computer build, or you're assembling an order for your customer to be shipped to your customer. Watch what happens when I manipulate this multi-select drop-down list, basic drop-down control. Basically, I'm going to select multiple parts from here. I'm selecting 1, 2, 3 parts. Almost immediately, my selections are listed in the second list box, right? And along with that, there is the total number of selections that have been reflected here instantly, right? A dynamic rule. Now, what you're seeing in action is a group of dynamic rules that are changing your application as you interact with them. Now, let me go back and undo all of these. Nothing. Now the selections are 2. Very good. So what is happening here are multiple things. One is you are using UiPath apps to transfer data between 2 complex controls. And you're also going to see how that app variable is going to change its nature. And we are going to use that attribute or that particular attribute of the app variables to actually transfer data between this control and this control, right? To the list control on the right. So going back to the design, here is the drop-down list example. And here is the multi-select drop-down. And once again, you are seeing a list control, that is a list function that is used to dynamically assign values to this drop-down. And the second thing is there is a selected value binding, which you also saw in that single select drop-down with the date picker example. But here you are going to see a very powerful feature of UiPath apps, the dynamic nature in which they behave. You have now bound this app variable to a multi-select drop-down. That means at runtime, this particular app variable behaves like a list control, right? It holds a list of values just like you see here, right? It holds a collection of values. And because of that feature, what we are doing is we have a list control here, and we are taking the output of this drop-down control or multi-select drop-down, and we are assigning that as an input to this control, right? So if I go into this list control, you will see that the list source is var selected parts, which is the output of the drop-down control. This is really very powerful because you can see you have done nothing special to say that the selected parts is a list of values. The app has automatically adapted to it, right? And that is why when I make those selections, you are seeing that a simple setup has built you an effective shopping cart-like application, an inventory management application, anything that will allow you to transfer data between complex controls in a user interface. And along with that, dynamically, the value of this selection changes. That is because we have an expression here that tells me, give me the count of those selections that I made, and I've assigned them to an other variable called var selected parts count. And this holds a number. Now, where is that coming from? That is coming from the event under the multi-select dropdown. If I go into the events, there is a rule that says, as I make selections in this box, or as I remove selections from this box, update the count dynamically. So if I go into the events, there's an assign value rule that says maintain the count of the parts selected by calling the count function on the var selected parts. You can see that the count function knows that the var selected parts is a list of values, and that's why we are able to run a count function on it, right? And this returns dynamically the values that you have selected or unselected and puts them into this parts count. And when you take the parts count and associate that with this expression, you are going to see this UI change dynamically as you interact with it, right? So this is really, really powerful. And I encourage you to, take a look at this and to get a feel of how you can build a really powerful UI with very simple setup, right? And you don't have to do anything. There's nothing special for you to do when you use that app variable. All you have to do is to tie it to an appropriate control, and the app knows how to behave. So this shows the dynamic nature of UiPath app variables.
This is great. Thanks, Andy.
Yep.
I believe we are a little over time, but
Yeah.
we are available for a few more minutes, and we'll like it to open up and answer rest of the questions
Yeah.
here. And feel free if any of you want to ask a question, you can choose either chat or you can unmute yourself and ask your question. One of the questions I think Justin Justin Lynch has, I asked to have Orchestrator API integrated because I feel that using a bot to perform Orchestrator API calls has more overhead. So I'm not sure the context. So if you don't mind, you can unmute yourself and share what scenario, what use case you're talking about. What you're
Sure.
actually using. Sure.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, so one of the things that my company wanted to do was kind of build an interface for our customers to be able to start or stop jobs on the
Mhm.
fly, right? And so the thing is, we would probably have maybe 1,000 people having that option, because each one would be dropping in a file, and they may want to either prevent it from being processed through a bot, or while it's processing, maybe have to make a change, and they'd have to stop the bot midway. And so we were kind of looking for a way to do that through the apps interface, and we were able to do it through the orchestrator API, right? But we had to basically have a bot run, execute the API calls, and it took longer than than I thought, that we thought it should have. So you were talking earlier, you mentioned some of the feedback that you gave back to Orchestrator. That's actually one of the ones that we asked, is if they could integrate the API, so we don't need a bot to do that, if that makes sense.
Right.
Primarily, what you're looking for is a front end for. So is that something they could rather than giving them access to Orchestrator, right?
Correct.
If I
Hmm.
understand correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah, a
Yeah,
much simpler interface.
exactly. Yeah, I
Yeah.
understand what you're saying. And UiPath could be one of the solutions. Have you looked at having them their own UiPath assistant? Because UiPath assistant that comes with the package, and they don't have to have Studio. They can only install assistant,
Yeah.
and they can trigger automation from assistant as well, rather
Yeah,
than building something out of right from the scratch, right? That could be another option you can look
yeah,
at.
yeah. I think that's actually something just recently we were talking about, is going the assisted route, and having it having it on their machine individually, as opposed to like an app, like the way UiPath Apps works. So yeah, I think that's a direction we might be
Yeah,
looking at.
it's easier to set it up. Because again, UiPath apps, we can do that because all the processes are available in the orchestrator, so
Mhm.
apps can directly access them. But you still would have to build another bot to actually do the handshake. right? What
Right.
you're trying to do, you're trying to trigger, pause, or stop, right? So
Mhm.
in rather than trying to navigate through that route, if possible, I would recommend to explore the possibility of using UiPath Assistant itself,
Okay.
to see if that works, because it provides it's pretty robust with the latest update on the UiPath
Right.
Assistant. You
Okay.
have options to provide input parameters as well right there.
Yep.
So that adds a lot of flexibility in terms of usage, right? And you don't have to build anything from by yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
I think,
that's
yeah, I
a
think I would say
direction that
give
we're
it a
looking.
try. Yeah, yeah,
Yep.
try that out. If that doesn't work, then maybe you go for the apps route.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yep.
Sure. Let me see what else. John has asked, John Egerter. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your last name. Please unmute yourself. You asked about some non-numeric inputs and formatting of numbers with in currency format, right? That's what your question, if I get that right. Would you like to elaborate on your question? Let me see if John is still here in the call. No, I think he dropped. John, are you there? All right, let's move on. Let's see anything else. And Narayan, I hope I answered your question. Do you have any follow-up to that?
No, I'm good. Thank you, Pradeep.
All right. That's all the questions, Andy.
Okay, great.
Yeah, we are 10 minutes over, and thank you. I really appreciate everyone staying a little longer, spending their evening time with us here,
Right.
discussing UiPath apps. And Andy, it was really very insightful. I'm sure developers loved it. All the you really went, you really gave us a deep dive introduction to how UiPath apps function validations works out. So
Right.
it's really, I really appreciate that. And I believe it was really helpful and beneficial for our audience too.
Yeah,
So
we can share this app with the audience, and they can download it and use it to get started learning, how these things were built, and they'll get to, with this video, they'll get to learn apps, functions, and expressions pretty quickly, I think. And
Andy,
yep.
yeah, do you want to put your email in the chat? So if they want it, they can reach out to you.
Yeah.
Great. So while he's doing that, I just want to thank everybody for coming tonight. Thank you, Andy and Pradeep. Great talk as usual. And I know everybody got something out of tonight's session. It's really interesting. And don't forget that we have the next session listed in the chat as well. So we hope you join us next week.
yeah, please
Right.
sign up for the next session. We'll have more exciting content.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for attending, and I hope you have learned something really useful. And we are looking forward to see you in the next session.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks.
See everyone next week. Bye.
Bye.